President Jacob Zuma is set to deliver his State of the Nation address on Thursday. One of the subjects he's expected to touch on is that of racism. There have been a high number of high-profile cases, that is, in recent months. But how exactly is government dealing with the issue of racism? To discuss this, we're joined by Mngxitama, the national convener of the Black First, Land First. He'll be joining us from our Pretoria studios. And in studio with me, we have Ernst Roets. He's the Deputy CEO of AfriForum. Good morning to you both, gentlemen, for your time this morning. Firstly, let's just talk about the plans that were outlined by the President in his State of the Nation address last year. He said that there was a national action plan that would have been drawn up to address racism. Now, it seems like that paper is still a work in progress. When we look at South Africa today, I'll begin with you, Ernest, because you're closest to me. How do you think that racism is manifesting itself in South African society? What are the indicators that you watch?
Well, of course, racism is a problem in South Africa, but I think it's not nearly as big a problem as some people like Andile would like us to believe. If you look at studies that are done by research organizations, time and again the findings are the same. Less than a third of people in this country say that they've ever experienced any form of discrimination. There's a significant increase in trust within the black community towards white people in the last few years. About 79.4% of black people say they've never experienced discrimination by white people. And the amount of black people who believe that racism is the biggest unresolved problem in South Africa is about 3.9%, which is good news for Andile because he only has about 1% support, so there's some room for improvement for him.
Andile, I'm sure you're going to have plenty of responses, but before you get right into him, perhaps just respond to the part where he says that racism is exaggerated in South Africa. Do you think that's the case?
Well, the problem in South Africa is that we have conversations about ending racism with racists. The biggest problem in our country is that we have not, in fact, outlawed racism. AfriForum, which is a racist organization, is allowed to operate freely, to propagate its anti-black ideas, to defend land theft, and they deny the fact that there is a historical question of the oppression of black people and genocide that has been perpetrated against us. We are the only abnormal country where we allow those who have oppressed us to debate us on the questions of reparations and ending injustices. Racism, South Africa is a racist country. What we see from time to time is just the flaring up of individual acts of racism. But South Africa has institutionalized racism. That, if you want to understand it better, is to go to the distribution of wealth in this country and even just earnings. If you look at the JSE, black people, who are, by the way, 90% of the population, only have about 3% of the JST, the Johannesburg Exchange. Land. Only 35,000 white families and trusts own 80% of the land. And we are the black majority who are landless in our own country. That gives, therefore, the kind of arrogance that you see from AfriForum. That comes, of course, also from controlling in fact, state capture is exactly what they have done since 1652, and today they control the judiciary, if you like. That's why AfriForum can start an independent prosecution unit to go after black people, because they know that the laws of this country protect white people and white racism and white land theft and white corruption. So when you see black people behind a bakkie and put in a cage, that is just an individual expression of racism. But that happens within the reality of a racist anti-black society, which was created since 1652, and we did not address this matter in 1994. I'm sure you know there's a bill right now which attempted to outlaw racism, but that bill is wholly inadequate to address the matter because it does not understand that racism is the discrimination against black people by white people, and black people cannot be racist. And the best mechanism to address racism is to address the historical question of exclusion and oppression of black people, and that is the land question. If you don't touch the land question, you're going to continue to have AfriForum insulting us at any turn and continue to have programs to defend white interests.
Ernst, what's your response to that?
Well, firstly, I think this idea that black people can't be racist, which is propagated by Andile, it's laughable. I mean, he's not going to convince anyone. So I think it's just a convenient excuse for black racists to pretend that they're not racist, which is actually what Andile is doing now. And he's making these statements about white people owning 80% of the land. It's not true. There's no research that has ever found that. What has been found is that 79% of land in South Africa is privately owned, but that includes urban areas. It includes land owned by white people and black people and so forth. So he's making up these figures coming on national television.
Before we go on,
but I would like to respond.
Yeah, let me take you just back, just before you continue. In 2001 already, there was a national action plan that was formulated by the Human Rights Commission. It was commissioned by the former President Thabo Mbeki. And one of the things that they specifically outline in terms of dealing with racism, they say that we cannot address the issue of racism without looking at equality, dignity, and justice. So the conversation of racism cannot take place outside a context of also addressing the economic reform that then needs to come into place. So when Andile talks about the issue of land and its close links, it's talking about economic empowerment, really. So how do you view the conversation of racism in the context of economic empowerment? What do you see? How do you see that link there?
Well, firstly, let me just say, Andile talks about giving back the land. If you look at people who have claimed land, who have instituted land claims, only 7% of those people said that they actually want the land back. The rest said they want the money. They would rather have the money. So this idea of this surge that we must take the white people's land, it's just some racist agenda that Andile is driving. But the issue of equality, that's the point. We need to, the two are linked to each other, but it's not essentially the same thing. To say inequality and racism is the same thing is to say that if you work hard, if you achieve something in life and you are not black, it means you have stolen something or it means you are racist. The problem in South Africa about inequality is not unemployment so much, it's unemployability. And the reality is we have an education system that's in a complete crisis. We have 80% of schools being dysfunctional. We are, as South Africa, dead last in the world in terms of our education of maths and science. So we need to fix the education system. But you can ask Andile about that. He wouldn't acknowledge that.
But what about
because to acknowledge that...
What about economic disempowerment, Ernest, that is historically entrenched, that is structural because of where we come from as a country?
Yes.
What redress needs to take place there in order to deal with the systematic racism that exists in South Africa?
But what systematic racism exists?
Institutionalized racism. So let's perhaps begin with the fact that maybe some white people earn more than black people.
But so if a white person earns more than a black person, are you saying that that is racist?
It's institutional racism, yes.
No, it's not. You can't say if one person earns 100 rand and the other person earns 50 rand, the one who earns more is doing that.
But they're doing the exact same job.
No,
they're doing the exact same job.
It's not. No, it's not. The problem is we need to fix the education system. The problem is unemployability. That we have millions of people in this country who do not have matric, who do not have degrees, university degrees. They can't apply for work, or they can apply, but they don't get it because they're not qualified. But you can ask, as I said, you can ask Andile about education. He would deny it because then he would have to acknowledge that he would need to do something in his own community to solve the problem.
Andile, is the answer to the economic disempowerment that even the Human Rights Commission acknowledges in terms of redress of racism? Do you think it's what Ernst Roets is saying here, that it actually all lies in improving the country's education systems?
No, I mean, apartheid has made sure that it excludes black people from education. But racism also makes sure that white mediocrity, like the man in that studio, who is completely a mediocre person, he can't be leading anything, but only whiteness makes sure that he is able to do so, and is even debating with us. The responsibility of addressing racism is of black people. It is not of our creation. White settlers who arrived here in 1652 stole our land, enslaved us, created the wealth that they have today, continue to earn more than we do. And when we talk about earning more than we do, we're talking about even where we are more qualified than they do. So that is the function of racism. But it is not white people who are going to end racism. It is our responsibility. We cannot, and I think that we, as black people, we need to take ourselves seriously. be in this situation where we're sitting here and debating with racist beneficiaries of colonialism and apartheid about whether racism exists or not. That is unheard of. We mustn't allow it. It's an insult to us. Now, what have black people done? This is the big question. Since 1994, we have not used the nominal political power that we have to address the race question. We have not addressed the land question. We don't have a radical economic policy. And these are the things that will contribute to what ending institutionalized racism we're talking about. Our judiciary is still usually informed by interpretative mechanisms that reinforces racism. But really the base of the problem is the fact that we're excluded from our economy. We do not, as black people, own South Africa. We are beggars of jobs, for jobs from white people, because they own the economy, they own the banks, they own the mines, they own the land. We have nothing. So long as we have nothing, we're going to remain victims of racism. And the racism will be defined by us, the victims of racism, not the perpetrators, like that young man or whatever is in the studios representing this racist thing called AfriForum. We as Black First, Land First have submitted to Parliament an alternative bill to outlaw racism. We call it the anti-racism bill, and we will talk about it when we launch it now in February, mid-February, where we say, among other things, return the land, make it a principle that blacks can't be racist, because if you do, we black people, when we fight against racism, we're going to be the one locked up. We say also, finally, organizations which are racist, such as AfriForum, AWB, and so on, must be burned, must be outlawed. You can't have racist organizations operating whilst you want to end racism. That is what we're proposing to Parliament about dealing with some of these problems.
Ernest, now that you've heard his account of how government should be tackling the issue of racism, how do you think government should be dealing with racism in the country?
Well, firstly, I've noted that he's done exactly what I predicted. He doesn't acknowledge the education crisis. Racism is a problem. I'm not trying to say it's not a problem. I'm saying it's a fairly insignificant problem if you compare it to the education crisis, to crime, corruption, political leadership, and so forth. And this is not just my opinion. That's what the majority of black people say. If you look at polls in this country, I've quoted about 8 polls since the beginning of, or 8 different studies since the beginning of this interview. Andile has just made all these political statements.
Yes, I hear you, but on the issue of racism,
to answer your question,
yes.
The issue to solve it is, firstly, we must be consistent. When people commit a crime, as I think Andile said, and AfriForum must be burned, not banned. If that's what he said, then that's a crime. But when people commit crimes in their racist acts, they must be prosecuted. But we mustn't have a prosecution of one group while the other group is left out, well, which seems as that is what's happening at the moment. So we must be consistent in prosecuting that. But if it's a social issue that we're dealing with, we must also remember that we cannot argue that we have democracy and we have freedom of expression, but at the same time we're going to start throwing people in prison for their beliefs. So we need to address these issues. We need to address racism. We need to ridicule these people in public. But the fact of the matter is it's really not that big a problem. If a person like Penny Sparrow, who's some random estate agent that no one has ever heard of, makes frontline news, it's TV news if she says something that's insulting towards black people. She's not even encouraging a crime. It's TV news. Well, that sort of is evidence of the fact that white racism is not that big a problem. But within Andile's own organization, one of his own leaders make these statements publicly on Facebook and Twitter saying we must go out and we must start killing white people. We must set the property of white people on fire. That is a crime. So that must be dealt with according to the law.
So for you, it's not a big issue when a white woman refers to black people as monkeys.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I didn't say anything even close to
that. Then clarify it for me, please.
I'm saying that was a very insulting and offensive remark. But it's TV news when she says that. So in other words, it's not really that frequent a thing that happens. If it happened every day, then it wouldn't have been TV news if some unknown person said that about
organizations like the Network Opposing Racism, the answer that has been put together under this umbrella of tackling racism, many of them would actually disagree, because through the studies that they've been doing and the workshops, the dialogues that they've been having nationally, they found that people are experiencing incidents of racism, but many of them don't necessarily make it onto television news. So
yes,
that cancels out a bit of what you're saying.
No, people do experience racism. It's about 19–20% of black people say that they have ever experienced racism in this country.
This is based on the studies that you have found?
Yes.
Yeah, but now what about economically? How should government be dealing with racism?
The only way that you can... Okay, once again, when you're saying economic inequality, are you equaling that to racism? Because it's not the same thing. Dealing with inequality and dealing with racism are two different things. You can deal with racism in one way.
Do you not agree that fundamentally racism also has its roots in some form of inequality?
There's an overlap, yes, it does play a role.
That's what I'm talking about.
Let me give you an example. Yeah. Before these Employment Equity Acts were, and BEE and all of that was instituted, there was actually a study done among companies which found that 90% of these so-called white companies already had black upliftment and transformation programs in place before the law forced them to do that. So there's a lot that's being done, but you cannot say that if there's inequality, that equals to racism. So I'm having difficulty answering the question because I'm not sure to which part I must answer. How do we deal with racism or how do we deal with inequality? Because it's not necessarily the same thing.
Andile, do you agree with that?
No, obviously the responsibility of the recipients of benefits of racism is to deny that racism has created wealth for them, security for them, jobs for them, protection for them, and for us black people, we are victims. And it also, white racism creates the arrogance of somebody who's not black to speak on behalf of black people. That is white racism. That is the arrogance that comes with holding economic power and being protected by the laws and the norms of society. So AfriForum will not stop insulting us, and it will not stop getting into these debates where it denies the existence of racism. One of the things that we got to do as black people, if we are serious about getting our dignity back and ending racism, is to basically also outlaw the denial of racism. In other words, if a white person says there's no racism in South Africa, that must be seen as a breaking of the law. This has happened in Germany. In Germany, you can't deny the Holocaust. You can't. It's a law. It's against the law. So here in South Africa, we have racists who stole our land, who enslaved us, who today, using the notion of freedom of expression, say that they have the right to deny that the racism is there. Not only that, but this young man there, or whatever he is, he says things like, there's freedom of expression. So they, as white racists, he believes they have a right to be racist against black people, to call us monkeys and to do these things that they do. We argue as Black First Land First that part of the problem is to seriously outlaw these practices, but to go to the institutional base of racism. Because you see, if we don't address institutional racism, we're going to be chasing around individual white racists, such as the one we have in the studio, and this is going to waste our time. Let us disarticulate their power. Where does the power of racism come from? It comes from the ownership of the country, comes from the ownership of the land, of the economy, that reduces us as the black majority into a powerless majority. That is why we must insist on a new dispensation on the economic front, and on the other hand deal with individual acts of racism, including in particular outlawing the denial of colonialism, of apartheid and racism against black people today.
All right, Andile, thanks for that. We've run out of time, Ernest. I'm going to give you just a couple of seconds, your final words.
Well, I think in my whole life, I'm a child of the new South Africa. I've been outperformed everywhere I go by black people. There are millions of intelligent, hardworking black people in this country. I'm not that concerned about what Andile is saying, because I know he represents about a 1% group within the black community. And I think the reason why a person of him, which seems like a man with questionable intelligence, makes these type of statements, but he doesn't get support for what he's saying, is because black people have better things to do with their lives than to follow someone like this.
All right. Well, viewers, you make your own mind
for your
up.
land, don't worry.
Mngxitama, and he's the national convener of Black First Land First. In studio, he's in Durban, and Ernst Roets, the deputy CEO of AfriForum. I'm back with your full headlines in a moment. Stay with us.